Now that these preliminaries are out of the way, I can state our new hypothesis about secularization, which is simply this. And some of the ideas developed in the theology of a specific religion are secularized in the following sense. They spread in the form of topoi. So they take an apparently secular or religious guise by becoming topoi. So secularization then is a process of transforming specific theological ideas or clusters of such ideas into the topoi of a culture. I want to explain this hypothesis by distinguishing 4 steps. The first step is what I call in the paper theologizing. It's the process through which certain ideas are embedded and developed within a specific theological framework. Take early Christianity. It took certain ideas from Judaism or from ancient philosophy like soul, conscience, the Messiah, and developed these into fully fledged Christian theological ideas by transforming them, adding something, revising them in certain ways. The second step is what I call commonplacing. And once these ideas are formulated in a clear theological form, they're not yet present in society. And they have to be made available to the believers of a religion so that their life, their thinking, their way of acting can be structured by this religion. So that's what happens in the process or the step of commonplacing. They have to be made into the commonplaces of a society. That might mean that certain biblical expressions become widespread and are often used, become idioms or sayings of a particular culture or society. It might mean that more complex theological ideas like the equality of all human beings, for instance, becomes a common attitude, a common sense idea we all share. This is done through preaching in the first place, giving sermons to the believers, where the preacher articulates these ideas and thus make them available to the believers to think about their own life. Third step is the clustering of these different commonplace ideas. They're brought together and form clusters which actually integrate other ideas as well, because at any point of time the commonplace ideas circulating in a society are fairly disparate, incoherent, or can be incoherent sets of ideas, and coming from different sources. Some may come from the Bible in Europe, others come from natural sciences, yet others from ancient Greek culture, some from the past of a particular people or village or city or community. The clustering that takes place is when reasonableness comes in. And these different commonplace ideas have to be made coherent, consistent, compatible. And that's what happens in the step of clustering. They're brought together and their mutual relationships are discovered or decided upon by revising some ideas, rejecting some other ideas, adapting certain commonplace ideas to each other, changing concepts. Now, once this happens, you have clusters of commonplace ideas circulating in a society. And that's where the fourth step comes in, the step of secular theorizing. This means that the clusters of commonplace ideas that have come out of the step of commonplacing, the steps of commonplacing and clustering, are combined and recombined, interpreted, reinterpreted, articulated in different ways in order to develop more elaborate theories, new theories about different domains of human existence. say ethics, politics, psychology, epistemology, and so forth. And that's how philosophical theories develop. There's a permutation of the commonplaces. They can be combined in all kinds of new ways. And new elements can be added in order to create a consistent, coherent theory. I just want to illustrate this in terms of the commonplace ideas I started with, namely work is worship, equality, the gospel, preaching the gospel of equality, the dignity of labor. In one way, secularization is a solution to one of the central problems of Christianity and any other religion. Namely, how does the believer, common Christian, relate to the religious account about God and Christ and salvation in his everyday existence, in his everyday life? How does the fairly abstract theology become relevant for his thinking about the problems he faces in life, for his reflecting on his experiences, and how can these ideas and how can the theology shape his life as a Christian? Now, secularization makes the ideas of a specific theology available to the believer. And let's go to the first step. Theological ideas develop. In the monasteries in Christianity, where many of the main elements of Western Christianity developed, there's this saying or instruction which was given to all monks in almost all monasteries: ora et labora, pray and work. Basically, what this meant is that the way to worship the God of the Bible was through incessant prayer and labor. And monasteries were seen as special religious institutions where God's will is done. The monks became a special kind of clerical estate who really turned to the biblical God and really obeyed his will through incessant work and prayer and through a process of conversion, which I won't talk about, but which Sarah can explain because her thesis deals with this process of conversion. So work is worship. There you see a first element of how this idea developed in Western Christianity. And these clerics, monks and priests, were said to have a special place in God's plan of salvation. And they were called by God, they were performing a vocation by God to acquire spiritual authority so that they could command the common believers, the laity, and lead them to salvation. And that's why they had to go through this process of conversion and work and worship. Now, this changed radically during the Protestant Reformation, because there what you see is also a step or a phase in the process of secularization of Christianity, where what developed in the monasteries was transmitted to all the believers, to society at large. Balu calls this monasticization of daily life. And the Protestant reformers claimed that all believers had to become like monks and priests in some sense. Not in the sense that they had to lead separate lives within the walls of the monasteries or within the church, but that they had to lead lives of work and worship in their common professions, in their everyday life. So had to transform their lives as Christians through this process of turning to God. As carpenters, teachers, laborers, and these were all equally worthy vocations. Because Protestantism, the reformers claimed that there is no separate estate of priests and monks who are specially called by God and played his special role in his plan of salvation. They didn't have any exalted role. We all play the same kind of role in God's plan of salvation. We're all equal before God, they said, the reformers. And we just have to search for our specific place in God's plan or purpose, and then live a life of work and worship by following our vocation. So the obvious consequence is that all occupations, all jobs become vocations. You can be a carpenter, you can be called by God to be a carpenter, a garbage collector, a teacher, a researcher, anything. Now this is where the cluster of ideas which I started with comes from. And the idea that we're all equal as human beings develops here. The idea that work is worship was elaborated here, because all jobs now all occupations become ways of responding to God's calling and worshipping God. And the dignity of labor there is obvious, because even a garbage collector or a rickshaw driver can be called by God to do what he does. In the second step, well, I'll actually combine the second and third step, commonplacing and clustering. These ideas, these concepts had to be spread to the believers. First, in medieval Christianity, this notion that we shouldn't be lazy and we should work and we should imitate the monks and the way they worshipped and worked. But the medieval and early Christian preachers had a problem. Their basic conceptual resources were fairly limited. They had the church fathers, the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, some biblical stories, some elaborate theology, intricate theology, but few reflections on the problems people encounter in life, few reflections on common human existence. Fortunately, they could turn to a rich tradition of rhetoric and philosophical reflections on human existence, namely the classical Greek and Roman tradition. And they began to use excerpts from the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers to develop their sermons. Of course, excerpts that were suitable to a Christian framework and not obviously pagan. And they actually developed handbooks to give these kinds of sermons. They're called florilegia, anthologies, really. It refers to the word for flowers. These were flowers that you could use in order to develop your sermons. And this referred to a metaphor found in Seneca, which talks about developing new discourse through the use of topoi, or lokikomenes, talks about it in terms of a bee going from flower to flower, text to text, collecting nectar, the excerpts, the quotations which were taken from the texts, then ordering these excerpts in the beehive, the nectar in the beehive, ordering them in these books, florilegia, and then developing new discourse, the honey, so-called.